Are we on? Here? Go ahead.
Oh, are we going?
Uh-huh.
Okay. All right.
Okay, we can start.
Okay. David, you've written a very thoughtful book and a very thought-provoking book about the wave of immigrants that are in very significant numbers now living in Los Angeles. As a matter of fact, it's been projected that in the near future, 70% of the population of Los Angeles will be ethnic minority people, 40% Hispanic, 20% Asian, and 10% Black. What sort of things did you find as you walked into that scenario?
Well, I think the first thing that I found was this genuine transformation of the country, of the United States as it imagines itself and has imagined itself going on. I think in a way we should have been more alive to the impact of immigration, just given the sweep of American history. I mean, you could make the argument that America's been transformed several times by its immigrations, and that, if you like, the Native American country of millennia was transformed by the arrival of basically English settlers and African slaves, and that that country of the descendants of those English settlers and African slaves was in turn transformed by the arrival of people from southeastern and northeastern Europe at the end of the 19th century. And now that country of the melting pot, to use the cliche, is being transformed by this great new immigration from East Asia and the countries of Central and South America, and the Caribbean, I shouldn't forget that. This isn't to say, of course, there weren't Asians and Latinos in significant numbers and playing significant roles in the country before, but the immigration is a huge change and a huge event, and the demographics that you were just citing are really transforming. You can no longer speak honestly of certainly Southern California as an extension of Europe, the way I think a lot of people would still prefer to speak of it. You have to speak of it. I prefer to speak of it certainly as a place that's increasingly becoming an anthology of the peoples of the world.
You talk in your book about a reality gap, that people are into something that sounds like denial of this very significant population of peoples that are living in the same environment.
Well, I think to some extent, to talk in much broader terms than I'm perhaps qualified to do, you could argue that the whole society is in denial. That denial of aging, denial of tragedy, denial of all kinds of reality. But to keep the subject to immigration, I certainly think that's true in Los Angeles. People could not survive on the west side of LA, the prosperous, largely white, largely upper middle class west side of LA, without the enabling presences of the gardeners who look after the lawns, the nannies who look after the children while both parents are working their high-powered jobs, the busboys who clean up in the restaurants, on and on, you can make the list, the orderlies who sweep the hospital floors when people get ill in the hospitals that they're taken to. And these people are, almost without exception, either brown or yellow people. And yet, shockingly to me, when I first came to LA, people spoke as if these people weren't really there, as if the image I use in the book is of the Japanese bunraku puppet theater, in which somehow the people who dress the puppets and move them around the stage are not to be paid attention to. They're all clad in black and they move around. And then the puppets stand in the front of the stage and perform the actions. And you're somehow supposed to, as you watch this drama, forget about the enablers who move these puppets. And I think there's some truth to that in Los Angeles, in the relation between the people who do these dirty jobs and make the pleasant life of the west side of Los Angeles possible, and the people who enjoy these lives.
What are some of the factors, that contribute to this denial or this reality gap that people just won't accept what all of this means?
Well, partly it's because a city like Los Angeles is a modern horizontal city, a city where it is perfectly possible to spend your life in considerable ignorance of what's going on across town. I mean, if you contrast LA, where you drive everywhere, to, say, cities of the Midwest or the Northeast, where people, even if they live in the suburbs, once they arrive in the central core of the city, have to ride the public transportation and have to walk, and therefore do rub shoulders with a cross-section of people. You discover that in a horizontal city, it's like LA, it's very easy to forget about what's going on across the LA River. And yet, it's astonishing at the same time. I mean, I cannot tell you the number of times that I would sit at a dinner party in West LA and someone would say, well, you know, everyone in this town is writing a movie script. And I would sort of do a slight pause. And I would think, it became so customary that I stopped calling people on it. But I'd say, well, no, everybody in LA is not writing a movie script. Everybody you know is writing a movie script. The majority of people who live in LA are working in light industrial factories, or working in your kitchen, for that matter. That's the life of the increasing majority of people largely of color. And so, you know, those kinds of, it's perhaps the radical self-absorption of American life that makes this kind of reality gap possible.
You also say that Los Angeles is a microcosm of the nation and even of the world. What do you mean by that?
Well, I thought I partly chose LA, and I think I could have chosen a number of other cities which have had enormous immigrations, in part because I wanted to go to the place where the images of America were made. It's not so much that I'm interested in the book in talking about Hollywood, but it interests me that Hollywood is an important part of the Los Angeles story, and that if you see America in the movies or on television, you're seeing an America that's been manufactured in Hollywood. And so for me, LA was in some ways the paradigm, but it's obviously this immigrant story. This is one that can be found in most of the great cities of the United States. I think the proportions are sometimes different and the process is much more advanced in Los Angeles. But I think, but for me, LA is a paradigm. But I do feel that the great event of the late 20th century, and probably the great event of the early 21st century, will be the recognition, finally, that the world is not only a genuinely multiracial place, but largely a non-white place. And this is not a sense that while white people were, in the lovely phrase of an English Marxist historian of my acquaintance, the masters of the earth, was a very easy phrase or concept to take in. But it is the reality. 90% of the people of the world are people of color. This doesn't mean problems will disappear. One mustn't go all gooey-eyed and romantic about it. It doesn't mean other hateful things than racism won't crop up. I have a much too tragic a sense of the world to imagine that just because this particular change will happen, that the world will suddenly become utopia. I don't believe that for a minute. But I think the great discovery is that this transformed sense of the word. And I think that insofar as the United States, which once, if you like, was an anthology of the peoples of Europe, is increasingly becoming an anthology of the peoples of the world, can't help but have a tremendous effect on the country. And insofar, even as the United States remains one of the principal powers in the world, which it probably will, on the world as a whole.
So if many of the white people living in Los Angeles are denying this or refusing to see this problem, then how are minorities seeing the same thing or the same issue? Are they seeing it differently? Is it a different type of awareness?
Well, I think the awareness varies depending on which group you talk to. I think it would be romantic to imagine that minorities speak in one voice, romantic and maybe paternalistic as well. For example, for many black people, the arrival of immigrants from Mexico is very unhappy news. I'll give you one example. Watts in South LA, which is a famous, almost the exemplar of the black struggle in the West Coast in the 60s, is now 50% Latino. So you have institutions that were created at great cost by black people in Watts, the King Hospital being the most obvious example, in the name of community control. These are black-run institutions. And quite understandably, the Latinos who now comprise a near majority, or will, and certainly in demographic terms, because just in terms of birth rates, are likely to soon comprise a real majority, say, well, wait a minute, we should be represented here as well. So I think the picture is mixed. I would also probably add that I think that if racial conflict can be in any way resolved, if some kind of fairer redistributive system can be thought through, and if simply by weight of numbers entrenched habits of racism decline, I still think we are going to come up against questions of class, because frankly, if you ask me what the real reaction in the minority community is, I think I would probably say to you it depends which social class. That the reaction of a Salvadoran illegal worker is very different in, say, East LA, is very different from the reaction of a Taiwanese businessman and his family in Monterey Park. And that there are going, of course, to be racial interests and minority versus majority, to the extent that that term even means anything. But there's also going to be class interests. And I think it would be self-deluding on the part of those of us who would like things to be different in this country to imagine that just because someone has a particular skin tone, that they are going to act in the ways that we would perhaps like them to.
So not dealing with this problem, not addressing it, is going to have consequences, as all things do. One of the consequences that you talked about in your book and alluded to several times was the Blade Runner scenario. What is that? Well,
that's taken from that science fiction film about an LA overwhelmingly non-white and a kind of nightmare landscape of LA as presented by the filmmaker Ridley Scott in a film made in the early 80s. What people mean by it, it's a kind of shorthand that people use in LA for a kind of war of all against all, a kind of Hobbesian universe in which every group is set against every other group, and which nobody understands each other. I myself think that is that talking about the apocalypse is a kind of cheap way out, and that people, when people talk about the apocalypse, what they really are doing is shirking the hard work of trying to come up with some new solutions to things. I think that the main problem in Los Angeles at the moment, perhaps the most, is that this is a city that's really always had trouble distinguishing between illusion and reality. This is a place in which illusion and reality have tended to get confused. And so what needs to be administered to LA is a good dose of reality, and that is the reality of the new people who live there, the reality of another kind of city and perhaps another kind of country. And it's not that people have to decide necessarily right away what kind of institutions they want as a result of these changes, but they've got to start thinking about it and arguing about it. The point is that what LA has been doing, and I fear what most cities, I don't know enough about Seattle to know if that's been true here, but has been sort of hoping that things will sort of work themselves out without anyone putting any work into it. Well, that doesn't seem very likely. We know that that's not true in the private life. If you don't pay attention to what's going on in your private life, it kind of goes to rack and ruin. So why shouldn't that be true in the public life as well?
Well, we'll talk about, the situation in Seattle, but, back to the Blade Runner scenario then. If you're not quite convinced that that is going to happen, that that actually will take place in any significant degree, then what are some of the actual, real, immediate problems that will be a result of not dealing with this problem?
Well, the most important problem will be the second generation. I think the most obvious problem is what will happen to the children of these new arrivals. Because, look, you could, it might be a little hard-hearted to say this, but you could make the argument that all throughout American history, people have had a very hard time in the first generation. And while it's awful, the kind of life that maids who work in the West Side have, it isn't so very much worse than, say, the situation of an Irish maid in St. Louis in 1905. I think that case, I don't say we should just because an Irish maid had a hard time, a Salvadoran maid should too, but if you wanted to be very cold-blooded about it, you could say, this has always happened. But what has never happened before is a situation where the next generation couldn't get out of that economic crevasse. And that what I worry about most of all is that people are not making the kinds of jobs and opportunities available to the next generation. And if that isn't done, and if people don't start paying attention to that, then indeed something, perhaps not exactly like the Blade Runner scenario, but something just as awful could indeed take place.
As California, especially Southern California, that place that's referred to as the Southland by people in advertising, by people in radio, that area around Los Angeles, that whole surrounding area there, as things begin to deteriorate in Southern California, like the drought, the fear of fire, natural disasters, drought is related to agriculture, is going to displace some people, in the job market. Where are these people going to go if they leave California, Southern California? Where's the movement going, do you think?
Well, it'll go to the places that are prosperous. I mean, I would think, speaking in just parochial Pacific Northwest terms, that if the recovery of Seattle, for example, continues, that you'll see a lot of those people coming up here. I don't think that people didn't choose LA because, Don Johnson lives there. They chose LA because that's where the jobs are, because LA has been a job-producing engine since at least the late 1940s. But of course, if the kinds of ecological difficulties continue, and there's really no reason to think they won't. This is semi-arid desert that was never meant to support a metropolitan area of almost 20 million. There's no reason to think that people won't move on. In the terms of the immigrants, what always strikes me about the immigrants, those that I've met and the stories that I know, is simply that these are people who almost by self-selection are particularly enterprising. As to say, already if you leave a village in Guerrero or a little town by the Gulf of Fonseca to come north, you're already a much more energetic person than perhaps the guy down the road. That's just the way it works. So you're not going to say, oh, there are no jobs in LA, I think I'll stay here. You're going to move on.
Mm-hmm. It just seems that the natural choice is to move north. People have been doing it. There's a migration north to the industrial centers, north to where jobs at. It just seems inconceivable that these people would start to move east or that they would move south.
I don't see anywhere else they would go. I think in a more broader sense, the whole story of immigration is simply the representation of the real issues of the late 20th century and early 21st century, which are north-south problems. The east-west problems seem very minor, particularly now that the Cold War has ended, compared to the problems of the north-south. And again, the fact of the matter is that if you go to Tijuana and simply stand on the Mexican side of the border and say to yourself, now, okay, I've got a family. What should I do? And you think of and you've been to San Diego and you know what it looks like. What else would you do? You'd have to be mad not to try. Mm-hmm. I think that's the great story, and I think we better start waking up to that and start worrying, in terms of American policy, to move from Los Angeles to Washington, if you like. I mean, all right, we've worried about the rest of the world long enough. How about the neighbors?
I want to localize, that scenario and talk about it in terms of Washington, talk about it in terms of Western Washington. So what I want to do is I want to give you some stats and facts, and then I want you to tell me, can it happen here? For instance, since 1980, the Hispanic population of Washington State has grown by 80%.
Amazing.
You have an Asian community here, you have a black community, you have in Eastern Washington a heavy concentration of people who have gone there since the 40s to work in agriculture. Come back over to this side of the mountains and you have 50% of the enrollment in the Seattle public school system is ethnic minority children. You talk about the Pacific Rim, you talk about Workforce 2000, you talk about the free trade agreement between Mexico and Canada. The president of Mexico wants, as part of the free trade agreement, free movement across borders. There is a presence of the Asian and the Hispanic population here in Seattle. Now, taking all of those things into account, can it happen here? Is it happening here?
Well, I would suspect it's already happened. That would be my hunch. These are statistics that were entirely unfamiliar to me, but it seems to me to stand to reason that it would happen. I also think it's important, without becoming a sort of Pacific Rim booster, to make the point that increasingly the trade of this region of the United States is going to be with East Asia. These are the growing markets. These are the likely markets. And so the idea that there won't be some kind of cultural synergy with East Asia seems just very unlikely. It would be illogical if it didn't happen. People tend not to understand the material underpinnings of culture. The affection that Americans had for Europe also had to do with the fact that it was our trading partner, and that's changing, and nowhere is that more obvious, leaving aside all other questions, than in this part of the world where, if it not for the orders of Asian airlines, for example, Boeing would go broke.
So it can happen here. It is happening here. What can we learn from what's already happening in Los Angeles so that we don't have our own denial, so that we don't have our own reality gap?
Well, I think the first thing that people need to do here is face what's actually going on, is accept reality, is not take refuge in illusion. I must say that culturally, I think people in the Pacific Northwest, without sounding like I came to flatter you, are more, how should I put it, predisposed to deal with things in that way than people who do live in a place where illusion and reality have always been awfully hard to separate. Los Angeles.
In your book, toward the end of your book, actually in the ending of your book, you say, we must learn to love one another or die. Could it be that simple?
Well, it sounds simple, but actually I think it's probably the hardest thing in the world. But I think that unless we have the sense that our own habits and our own familiar things must be enlarged to accommodate the familiar things and habits of others, then we're really in trouble. And for me, really the only answer in that sense is a moral one, is finally, that is a kind of Christian, ethically at least, a kind of what I think is best about the Christian tradition, which is you do love your neighbors, and that's what the highest form of ethical behavior is.
Thanks a lot, for coming to Rainbow Express and and sharing your book with us and your thoughts, and enlightening us and giving us something to really think about as Seattle and Washington State starts to take on, in a more significant degree, what's already happened in Southern California.
It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.